Every other road on this channel was abandoned, renamed, or left behind. The Central Artery was demolished on purpose because the city decided the road itself was the problem. It cost $24 billion to erase one elevated highway, which is precisely why no other American city will ever do it. The symmetry to hold on to, the artery destroyed 1,000 buildings to be built, and then was itself destroyed. Two demolitions, 50 years apart, on the same strip of ground. For 44 years, an elevated highway ran straight through the middle of downtown Boston, 6 lanes of steel and concrete painted green, carrying traffic directly over the north end. It doesn't exist anymore, not decommissioned, not bypassed. Torn down, deliberately, deck by deck, and replaced with a tunnel underneath the exact same ground. It is the only major urban highway in America to be removed this way, and the reason it's the only one is the number. Boston will finish paying for it in 2038. The Central Artery was an elevated section of what became Interstate 93, cutting north to south through the center of Boston. Construction began in 1951. It opened to traffic on June 30th, 1959, and building it meant demolishing the city it ran through. Over 1,000 buildings came down. Roughly 20,000 people were displaced, most of them working-class residents of dense central neighborhoods that had existed for generations. 3 of Boston's historic public squares were razed entirely: Adams Square, Scollay Square, and Haymarket Square. The city also lost the property tax base underneath all of it, a figure put at around $20 million in early 1950s money. Verify. This wasn't unusual. It's what urban highway construction did across America in that era, in dozens of cities, to broadly the same kind of neighborhood. What makes Boston different is what happened next. Because the road that cost 1,000 buildings and 20,000 homes failed almost immediately. The Central Artery was designed to carry roughly 75,000 vehicles a day. By the early 1990s, it was carrying around 200,000. Traffic was at a standstill for more than 10 hours a day. The accident rate on it ran at roughly 4 times the national average for urban interstates. Projections at the time suggested that without intervention, Boston was heading for 16-hour daily congestion by 2010, at an estimated cost to motorists of around $500 million a year. The nicknames tell you how the city felt about it. The Distress Way, the largest parking lot in the world, and the one that stuck locally, the other green monster, because the girders were painted the same shade as the left field wall at Fenway. But congestion was only half the problem. An elevated 6-lane highway is a wall. It ran between downtown Boston and the waterfront, and it cut off the north end and the harbor from the rest of the city. The land underneath it was dark, loud, and used for parking. Boston had spent 1,000 buildings and 20,000 homes to acquire a structure that jammed within a year and severed the city from its own harbor. The idea was to take the highway underground, not reroute it, not widen it. Put the entire thing in a tunnel beneath the existing road, keep the old highway running the whole time, and then demolish it once the tunnel opened. The concept dates to the 1970s. It took until 1991 to break ground. 2 decades of planning, environmental review, funding fights, and political negotiation before a shovel moved. Formally, it was the Central Artery/Tunnel Project. Nobody called it that. The scope was enormous, and it wasn't just the artery. The project also extended Interstate 90, the Massachusetts Turnpike, from its old terminus through a new tunnel beneath South Boston and the harbor out to Logan Airport. It built a 14-lane crossing of the Charles River across 2 new bridges. The initial cost estimate was around $2.8 billion. Verify. Hold on to that number. Consider the actual problem. You need to excavate a tunnel 8 to 10 lanes wide directly beneath an elevated highway carrying 200,000 vehicles a day. And that highway has to stay open throughout because there is no alternative route, and shutting it would paralyze the region. You're doing this in a city built partly on landfill with a high water table, under streets containing 300 years of accumulated utilities, sewers, and subway tunnels. The techniques used to solve that were unusual even by megaproject standards. Slurry walls. Rather than digging an open trench, crews excavated deep, narrow trenches filled with a dense slurry that held the walls up under pressure, then poured concrete into them from the bottom, displacing the slurry. That gave you structural walls in the ground before any excavation happened, so the ground never had a chance to collapse, and the elevated highway above stayed supported. Ground freezing. In some locations, the soil was too soft and too wet to tunnel through at all. The solution was to freeze it, circulating refrigerant through pipes driven into the ground until the saturated soil became a solid mass that could be cut through like rock. Tunnel jacking. In one of the most difficult sections, tunnel segments had to pass beneath active railway lines carrying commuter and intercity trains. Rather than dig down from above, enormous prefabricated concrete boxes were pushed horizontally through the frozen ground beneath the tracks, with services running overhead the entire time. The Central Artery tunnel opened to traffic in stages. The old elevated highway carried its last vehicles in December 2003. Demolition followed. Construction was substantially finished by the end of 2007. The final construction cost of the highway and tunnel work came to approximately $14.5 billion against that original estimate of around $2.8 billion. But that's not the number, because most of it was borrowed. The state used roughly $7 billion in federal aid and financed the rest through bonds issued across multiple authorities, refinanced repeatedly with a final maturity in 2038. Add the interest, and the total borne by state and federal taxes and tolls comes to around $21 billion. Then add one more layer. 2 decades earlier, in order to obtain federal environmental approval, Massachusetts had committed to a set of public transit improvements to offset the additional traffic the project would generate. Those commitments were legally binding and they were delivered: the Silver Line, modernization of the Blue Line, commuter rail extensions. With those included, state officials publicly put the full cost at more than $24 billion. In 2012, the state's transportation CFO testified that Massachusetts still owed around $9.3 billion in principal and interest, with annual debt service running at roughly $550 million a year. That's $500 million a year that cannot be spent on any other bridge, road, or transit project in the state. One official's summary of the position at that hearing was blunt: they didn't build it, but it's theirs to manage. Just after 11 o'clock at night on July 10, 2006, Angel and Milena Del Valle were driving through the Interstate 90 connector tunnel toward Logan Airport. The ceiling of that tunnel was formed by concrete panels, each weighing around 4,600 pounds, suspended from the tunnel roof by bolts anchored in epoxy. A section of that ceiling came down onto their car. Angel Del Valle survived. Milena Del Valle, 39 years old and a mother of 3, was killed. The National Transportation Safety Board investigated, and what they found was not exotic. The epoxy used to anchor those bolts had poor resistance to something called creep, the tendency of certain adhesives to deform slowly and continuously under sustained load. It holds fine in a short-term pull test. Over years of carrying constant weight, it gradually gives way. A fast-set epoxy had been used in an application requiring long-term load-bearing performance. 20 anchors pulled free. The NTSB spread responsibility across the design consultant, the project management consortium, the construction contractor, and the epoxy supplier for failing to identify creep as a critical long-term failure mode and for failing to account for it in design, specification, and approval. Now the part that makes it worse. In 1999, 7 years before the collapse and 4 years before that tunnel opened to the public, bolts failed during testing. Concerns were raised about the anchors. Further testing was declined. The tunnel opened to traffic in 2003. And in the years between opening and the collapse, an attorney for the Del Valle family stated that no inspection of those anchor bolts was carried out. The epoxy supplier was charged with involuntary manslaughter, the only company to face a criminal charge. The family reached a settlement of $6 million with that company in 2007, and a further settlement totaling approximately $28 million with 15 defendants in the 2008. Sections of tunnel were closed for months while every suspect anchor was replaced. The largest and most expensive highway project in American history killed a passenger with a glue failure that had been flagged 7 years earlier. Travel times through the corridor fell substantially. By one state measure, hours spent traveling on the project highways dropped around 62% between 1995 and 2003. Carbon monoxide levels in the downtown area fell as traffic stopped idling, and the wall came down. Where the elevated Central Artery stood, there is now the Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy Greenway, roughly 17 acres of linear park running through the middle of downtown Boston, on the exact footprint of the highway. The North End and the waterfront are connected to downtown again for the first time since 1959. The project created over 300 acres of open land in total, and the Seaport District, which was essentially cut off before, has been redeveloped extensively since. There's a naming detail that's almost too neat. The original elevated artery was named for John F. Fitzgerald, a former mayor of Boston. The park that replaced it is named for Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, his daughter. The road was named for the father. The park built on its grave is named for the daughter. Critics point out fairly that the Big Dig didn't eliminate congestion. It moved bottlenecks outward to the approaches, and it spent $24 billion reinforcing car dependency in a city that could have spent it on transit instead. Both things are true. The tunnel works. It cost an amount of money that is difficult to justify by any conventional measure. There are elevated urban highways exactly like the old Central Artery in cities across the United States, built in the same decades, through the same kind of neighborhoods, with the same consequences. Severed districts, displaced residents, structures now well past their design life. Most cities know it. There are active campaigns in several of them to remove or bury a highway. Almost none of them will, because the Big Dig established the price. Not the $2.8 billion in the original estimate, the $24 billion in the final accounting, plus a debt schedule running to 2038, plus $500 million a year that couldn't be spent on anything else. That number now sits in every conversation about removing an urban highway anywhere in America. It is the single most cited argument against trying, which produces a genuinely strange legacy. The Big Dig is simultaneously the proof that it can be done. The tunnel exists, the wall is gone, the park is real, the harbor is reconnected, and the reason nobody else will attempt it. A few cities have removed elevated highways at far smaller scale, usually after an earthquake or a structural failure forced the decision. San Francisco took down the Embarcadero Freeway after it was damaged in 1989. But that's demolition without replacement. You remove the road and disperse the traffic. Boston did something different. It removed the road and kept the capacity by putting it underground. That's the expensive version. And it's the version nobody has repeated. Stand on the Greenway today and there is essentially nothing to indicate what was there. No preserved column, no section of deck kept as a monument. The elevated highway that dominated downtown Boston for 44 years, that a generation of Bostonians organized their city around and complained about constantly, has been removed so completely that you would not know it existed. The traffic is still there. It's just below your feet, in a tunnel, doing the same job the green structure did, only faster and out of sight, which is the strangest part of this whole story. Every other road on this channel was erased by neglect. Somebody stopped maintaining it, somebody deleted a number, somebody built a faster route and walked away. This one was erased on purpose, at enormous expense, over 15 years, by a city that decided a road was a mistake and paid to undo it. 1,000 buildings came down to build the Central Artery. 20,000 people lost their homes. 3 public squares were razed. 44 years later, the road that replaced them was itself demolished, and the ground it occupied was turned into a park named after the daughter of the man the road was named for. The whole cycle, build it, regret it, bury it, took about half a century and roughly $24 billion, and Boston will be paying for it until 2038.